All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Uh, actually very lucky to have Mabel Wilson here today because she is on sabbatical. And usually when people go on sabbatical, they don't want to do these kind of things. And she said that she has not given any lectures for almost a year, but because she's doing her own thing, doing her own work, but she agreed to come here from her sabbatical. So we really appreciate that, Mabel. Mabel is really an extraordinary person. I've known her, we just realized, for almost 25 years. She went to graduate school at Columbia. Then she did a PhD at NYU in American Studies. And then she's taught all over the country, spending the most amount of time at California College for the Arts, at CCA, and at University of Kentucky, but has also taught at Princeton, Ohio State. And then she came back to Columbia and was hired at Columbia and has been there for 9 years. And she currently is really a core voice and core faculty member at Columbia, and she's the Nancy and George Rupp Professor of Architecture. Mabel has done a lot of work in different areas, but what she's going to talk about today is the project that she started about 5 years ago with a group of people called Who Builds Your Architecture? And I was actually at one of the very first it was kind of an off-the-record, behind-closed-doors meeting where the people who organized this and several architects and artists and an interesting group of people just got together to start talking about issues around architecture, construction, the globalization of design and construction, around human rights and the reality of the conditions on site. And these were issues that at that time were they weren't even on the radar of anybody. It was just kind of glossed over. As an architect, if you were really successful, you were doing these projects all over the world in very exotic places, very exotic architecture, with no sense of what was really happening when these things started to be implemented. And I think this project, this advocacy project, started to look at the reality of labor, of technologies, of the processes, of all of the kind of things that really go into making buildings around the world in different countries. And it has really caught traction and become something that has got the attention of the media. It's gotten more importantly, it's gotten the attention of the architecture community to kind of be aware of this. You know, it's easy for us to say, well, we just design these things, contractors build them, you know, whatever techniques they use is kind of up to them. But the reality is that as architects, we have to be aware of how our buildings get built. And that's really what this project is all about. So we're very excited to have Mabel here to talk about this. So welcome.
Hello? Wait, I'm pretty sure it's on. Yeah, it's on. Hello? No, it's not working. Uh-oh. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. All right, perfect. All right, so now it is working. Rotate this. Great. So thank you, Scott, for that excellent introduction to some of the things that I've been doing. And I think like Scott mentioned, this kind of just happened as a project. So I'll explain a little bit more about that. But I just want to say thanks for the invitation here. It's a pleasure to be back at Georgia Tech. I think I gave a talk here 8 years ago, maybe 10, I can't remember. And so I really enjoyed that, and I know a number of the faculty, and I've certainly met a number of graduates from here. So I'm delighted to be here. And I just also wanted to say thank you to Tia and Kelly also for making my trip possible. So My talk this afternoon will take on important questions about the nature of the architecture profession in this current moment, when the field must address things pressing both ecological, political, and social imperatives. It asks, beyond the architect as builder, what are alternative forms of practice? And so part of what I want to talk about is what do you do with advocacy? Like how are the skills and the techniques that we actually learn as architects can be used to basically do other kinds of work? And can architecture as a field of intellectual research be energetic, critical, and radical? So our advocacy project, Who Builds Your Architecture, deploys the tools, methods, and approaches of architecture to probe and evaluate how the building process, locally and globally, impacts the work and life conditions of those who build our architecture. As WBYA, that's basically what we call ourselves, question mark, which is very important. We're academics, we're all designers, fabricators, actually, curators, some of us, writers, and students who advocate for fair labor practices on job sites around the world. My collaborators are Kadambari Bakshi, Jordan Carver, Laura Diamond Dixit, Lindsay Wickstrom, Tiffany Rattray. Beth Stryker, who now runs the nonprofit cluster in Cairo, was an early collaborator and participant in Who Builds Your Architecture. So for my talk today, I'm going to explain a little about our origins, then talk about the global forces that actually contextualize the problems of labor and architecture. And then I will explain how we've gone about developing and understanding our understanding of the terrain, our position, methods of working, and outcomes, and conclude with the trajectories of future action that WBYA is currently pursuing. Questions. So we were inspired by the Gulf Labor's Coalition's petition launched in spring 2011. And I don't know if people probably don't know that or remember that. Gulf Labor is a group of artists primarily, but also scholars, all of them activists. And their efforts raised awareness of the human rights violations that were taking place on Saadiyat Island, a large-scale development project in Abu Dhabi where the Guggenheim Foundation was planning to construct a new multi-million-dollar museum designed by American architect Frank Gehry. So this was the original petition from the Gulf Labor Coalition. And what was remarkable was that a number of these artists, some of them extraordinarily well known, like Walid Rad, who just had a show at Museum of Modern Art, and others not so well known artists, they were protesting the Guggenheim and refused to have their work shown or collected by the Guggenheim. So it was coming at a great cost to many of these artists in a way, but they felt that it was very important that they take a stand and not show their work in a museum that might be built with slave labor. And I'll explain a little bit by what I mean by that, but by forced labor. And so they took a really strong stand to try to basically get the Guggenheim to be responsible and ethical about how they were going to build the project. So this was the pledge that they put out, and there were a number of signatories in it. And so it circulated fairly widely. So Gehry's transcendent design would help the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, according to their website, quote, contribute to a more inclusive and expansive view of art history that emphasizes the convergence of local, regional, and international sources of creative inspiration, rather than geography or nationality. But a backlash ensued. Artists, curator, and theorists whose work we admired because of their radical stances on social and political issues had signed the petition. Some were friends and some were colleagues. The signatories, many were artists based in the Middle East, refused to cooperate and collaborate with the Guggenheim or any other branch unless contractual guarantees were offered from the foundation that would, quote, protect the rights of workers employed in the construction maintenance of this new branch museum in Abu Dhabi. However, we noticed something unusual about the petition. Among the list of signatories, not one was an architect. We scanned the media and the archisphere, but no outrage or debate had erupted about the dire conditions and the human rights violations of the construction workers. Any sort of critical commentary about the workers who would build an $800 million, 450,000 square foot behemoth along the Persian Gulf was nowhere to be found. That's it. So, with that in mind, over the past 5 years, we've been directing the question, who builds your architecture? To professional, maybe it might be because, maybe it's because this isn't, is that better? Okay, wait, let me, okay, nope, yes, no. Okay. So we've directing the question to professional organizations, architectural firms, and architects, and can report that it's been largely met with silence or polite evasion. Those architects who did respond to our query often cited contractual constraints as the reason why they had no power to intervene in the exploitation of workers involved in constructing their design. This rationale categorically casts the problem of responsibility outside the purview of the architecture profession. It echoes the response offered by architect Zaha Hadid when the Guardian newspaper asked the Pritzker Prize-winning architect in February 2014 to comment on the deaths of migrant workers on Qatar's construction sites, where she had been commissioned to design the flagship stadium project for FIFA's 2022 World Cup. Now, the project was not under construction yet at all, but this was in regards to some of the infrastructural projects and so forth that were related to FIFA. She said, quote, "I have nothing to do with the workers," she observed, and quickly transferred the responsibility for the rights to the authority of the state. She said, "I think that's an issue the government, if there is a problem, should pick up. Hopefully, these things will be resolved." Quote. Hadid expressed her deep concern over the deaths in the Iraq War, but asserted that just as she could not intervene in that conflict, architects like her were not obligated to guarantee the fair treatment of construction workers. "I'm not taking it lightly," she added, "but I think it's for the government to look to take care of. It's not my duty as an architect to look at it." End quote. Now, Hadid's choice of the word duty illustrates the risk aversity and class divisions that characterize the mentality of construction and design industries. Like many of her defenders, she was highlighting the fact that the architect's contractual obligations are at the service of the project's owner and do not extend to the contractors and workers engaged in realizing their design. While this might seem to be a technical distinction, it shields architects from claims that they have any sort of legal responsibility toward construction workers. The word duty points to the very carefully defined accountability that minimizes risk to architects and insulates them over the course of the construction process. But it also evokes the perceived class distinctions drawn between the intellectual labor of the design professional and the physical labor necessary to build the building. As mentioned, Gehry, another Pritzker Prize winner, has long been the focus of Gulf labor's criticism as the architect of the Guggenheim Museum in Abu Dhabi. In contrast to Hadid, Gehry hired Scott Horton, a prominent human rights lawyer, to consult about protecting the well-being and rights of the workers constructing the Guggenheim project. So Gehry actually did the right thing. I mean, he recognized that this is going to be a very knotty issue and actually hired an attorney to capital A, architecture, has become a significant visual representation of globalization and networked economy. Like finance and manufacturing, the design of cities and the construction of buildings define today's global architectural practices that straddle many different national and cultural milieux. The example of the global city, global university, global event are predicated on the construction of these large campuses, unique buildings, spectacular entertainment facilities, whose owners circulate their alluring images throughout the world. And I've done some research in Lagos. There's a big project in Lagos, and part of what they talk about is this will be, Nigeria's Dubai. So it's amazing how these then start to circulate, these ideas, these images, circulate worldwide. Yet beyond the boosterism, touting things like sustainability, regeneration, sport, and tourism as desired outcomes from these buildings, these new buildings, packaged in a range of design aesthetics from traditional to futuristic, human rights reports and investigative journalism have revealed how the thousands of construction workers employed to build some of these signature projects, other less prominent buildings, and massive infrastructural projects have been ruthlessly and routinely exploited. To better understand these kinds of declarations by leading architects, we realized that we needed to better understand how the global supply chain of the construction industry produces buildings. Not simply how buildings are conceived by architects, but also how they are materialized by a network that mobilizes architects, construction workers, and a host of other actors. This required an approach that deploys the representational tools and techniques of architecture, along with a critical analysis that explains and makes visible architecture's entanglements within geopolitical and economic structures. The agency of the architect, by definition, is a delicate balance. Architects, as opposed to artists, are often hired not just for their with the growth and the intensification of globalization, regardless of definition, urbanization in various regions around the world has functioned as lucrative terrain for surplus capital generation, a growth facilitated by the internationalization of finance markets. The property market, writes David Harvey, quote, has absorbed a great deal of surplus capital through new construction. With the rise of now precipitous fall of the industrializing BRICS nation, and that was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with various forms of resource extraction and debt financing, providing new sources of capital for both public and private investment, urban development has become a primary vehicle for generating profit and wealth. The construction sector, which is flooded by development financing on the construction end and mortgage financing on the business and consumer end, has become so large and successful that it functioned as a leading economic indicator for many national economies. This was brought into dramatic relief in 2008 when the global economy collapsed due to large-scale default of American mortgage payments. The payments themselves were indicators of the housing market bubble that have been propping up the U.S. economy through a complex financing system linking the economies of individual home construction and the securitization of mortgage debt traded on a global scale. Now, this is clearly what The Big Short was about. And if you haven't seen the movie 99 Homes, I highly recommend it because I think it's the other side of what The Big Short is telling us about what went wrong with the housing market. Now, similarly in China, whose cities remain empty as a result of optimistic town planning and an economy predicated on construction and urbanization, the overabundance of housing and real estate stock and its concurrent slowdown in new construction has led to an economic slowdown in China, and that's most recently. I always love this image. But these are, okay, this is the Go City. But the sense that there's a wholesale investment in a lot of these projects, particularly the Olympic projects, but then they often end up being abandoned. And yet, obviously, profit is being somehow taken out through the movement of all of the money. So the Chinese government is currently planning whole cities and massive infrastructural projects in Africa. U.S. companies construct factories in Mexico's duty-free and tariff-free Maquiladora zones. Goods move from duty-free economic zones to free port and speculative real estate in New York and London. And speculative real estate in New York and London is used to warehouse wealth. I call these space deposit boxes are my terms for what's going on. Each typifies how large-scale construction projects become vehicles of cross-border government-brokered economic expansion. Public and private investment has been channeled into nation-branding enterprises to reshape and homogenize the skylines of Astana, Rio, Gwangju, Doha, Taipei, Miami, Lagos, and many others seeking world-class status to attract financial partners, but more importantly also tourist dollars. Reinhold Martin, my colleague at Columbia, takes architectural measure of these transactions when he observes that, quote, architecture and urbanism form one element in a complex network of cultural practices that make financial globalization, and by extension, its crises, not only visible, but also imageable, and therefore possible. So in this regard, architecture produces an alluring image of the future in which vertiginous forms and feats of engineering, such as twisted helices and bulbous pine cones, signify the future of many sorts of businesses, their shopping malls, storefronts, museums, and so forth. By adapting a set of global architectural branding strategies and tropes, you can find, for example, Tuscan villas all around the world. I mean, you see these in China, you can find these in South Africa, you see these in Nigeria, you see Tuscan villas, you know, these sort of subdivisions around the world. So cities demonstrate that they, along with nations, can embrace foreign investment. Such moves build up and transform a city's physical inventory and allow them to attack cultural and heritage networks, such as the Guggenheim or UNESCO, to leverage visibility and prestige. However, to erect many of these award-winning projects, thousands of migrant construction workers are recruited. This is a very large-scale project in Hong Kong that one of our collaborators, Jordan Carver, actually saw in January. So this is the scale and the constant sort of construction of cities. NYU Abu Dhabi, perfect example. So these are the thousands of migrant construction workers who are recruited. They end up laboring at building sites under exploitive conditions that include things like withheld pay, poorly regulated labor recruitment practices, lax safety measures, and substandard housing. How these buildings and mega projects are erected stands in direct contradiction to the aspirations of cultural openness and historical significance these cities and nations wish to project to the world. So for the cycle of capital accumulation to generate additional wealth through large-scale building projects, a substantial workforce employed over the course of several years of construction is needed. If the local pool of labor is too small, especially for projects requiring an army of workers, thousands strong, then private contractors or state authorities draft a labor pool of migrant and immigrant populations who live elsewhere. On building sites in places like Saadiyat Island, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Qatar, for example, construction workers are being recruited from all parts of the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Northern Africa. According to Amnesty International, there are more than 1.35 million foreign nationals working in Qatar, a country home to approximately 250,000 citizens. Since migrant workers are not citizens, and this also includes domestic workers, so there are a number of expatriates actually, and domestic workers, I should say, which are often women, face very similar issues that construction workers, which are typically male, also face in many of these situations. So since migrant workers are not citizens of the nations in which they work, they have very few rights. There are very few avenues available for abused workers to protest for treatment, even though many have committed to multi-year labor contracts. Construction workers often face unscrupulous conduct by recruitment firms, subcontractors, and local authorities. Persistent problems with the recruitment process can involve exorbitant fees charged by recruitment firms and false representations of the type of work and compensation offered. So imagine coming to think you're working for one job in one company and then actually doing something else, but often being paid less for that. And I'll give a quote that sort of, I'll play a video that actually starts to give you a sense of what that would mean. Employers confiscate passports to prevent flight or deliberately fail to issue proper identification cards that would allow workers to move freely around the city. Migrant workers are also subject to dangerous and at times deadly conditions on job sites. In worst-case scenarios, workers lived in poorly maintained or substandard accommodations located in sprawling workers' camps. Companies construct these camps at the outskirts of cities far from job sites and areas where amenities can be easily accessed. The worker camps are the result in the segregation of a large population of men outside of the civic and economic life of the city that they are actively constructing. This separation produces the dual effect that keeps workers from integrating into the social and cultural life of the host city and curtails the establishment of migrant-owned businesses that might fuel additional movement of both men and women to a particular region or city. Their isolation and lack of political agency also stifles political reforms that would open the host nations to more immigration and to the creation of immigrant communities that would form outside the purview of the current limited employment contract. Because of the challenges posed by jurisdictional differences between the nation-states where the migrant workers come from and the countries where they work, human rights and international labor organizations have been systematically challenging the legalities of the current recruitment system found in many parts of the world. The law is clearly the primary area in which to intervene and abolish exploited dimensions of the current system. And so on that point, I think Zaha Hadid's right. It is something for governments to contend with. However, many of the problems migrant construction workers face are often inherently spatial, urban, and architectural in nature. Research on large transnational construction projects reveals how the global construction supply chain moves workers, architects, engineers, capital and debt, building materials and waste to and from building sites, but in very unequal ways. But it is also within these spaces where we find the possibility for critical imaginaries that initiate new social movements, not only among the ranks of the disenfranchised construction workers, but also in direct relation to the architects who create the drawings that instruct the workers on how to build the architecture. Building advocacy. To address the problem of fair labor practices at construction sites requires a range of approaches that engage the ethical, political, economic, social, and cultural dimensions of the issue. WBYA began its advocacy project by asking the question to architects: who builds your architecture? We asked the question to initiate dialogues in various educational and professional arenas. In answering the question, we discovered the myriad of ways that architects are linked to construction workers at job sites around the world. Now, to identify the networks that link architects and construction workers, WBYA initially hosted a series of local public panels. Well, WBYA hosted a series of local public panels, closed-door discussions, this is one of the ones that Scott attended, and workshops. We had architects, human rights activists, artists, educators, students, and the public attended these events held in venues such as the Vera List Center for Art and Politics, which is at the Parsons New School, the Architectural League in New York, and Studio X, New York. As an ongoing dialogue about the issues facing migrant construction workers, we have also presented our findings at conferences on labor, architecture, and human rights in Sweden, Italy, Abu Dhabi, Canada, and around the United States. The public panels were a way of uncovering the issues. So this is the first thing we did, because I'm not an expert on this. I absolutely knew nothing, I should say, about this topic before we started working on it. So one of the ways we tried to do was to say, okay, who builds your architecture and who can we get to actually come and talk about this thing? However, it was quite challenging to find architects who were willing to discuss the issue. We approached corporate firms with well-known acronyms, as well as vanguard practices who slice and dice all the edges. But polite declines filled our ears and our inboxes. But we pressed on and then uncovered and convened our first panel, hosted by Karen Kawoni, director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics. We posed the issue as follows. With architects building globally, often disconnected from their own cultural political context, what is the responsibility toward the workers who construct their buildings? Frequently designed by star architects from far away, dazzling towers, community campuses, museums, and office complexes are rising in the United Arab Emirates, the Near and Far East. But where do the workers who build them come from? Where do they live? What is their legal status? This panel probes whether the architect's uninhibited creative expression is dependent on cheap labor performed by seasonal laborers, and what the ethical possibilities of new technologies be that are transforming the design and engineering, but also reduce manual labor-intensive construction methods. So we had a number of things that we were trying to sort of figure out. So our participants in this first one included cities. There was Andrew Ross, Fred LeBrot. We had Andrew Ross was a member of Gulf Labor, and Fred LeBrot, who's a colleague of mine at Columbia, who had done done projects both in Dubai, but also done work in Afghanistan, which is very interesting. Bill Van Esveld, who is at Human Rights Watch, and then Peggy Deemer, who has done a number of books on looking at architecture, capitalism, and labor. So that was the panel, and I am going to play this.
As an architect are helping to get off the ground. And so I think it would be useful just to bring this down to a very human level. Who built your architecture? And just imagine yourself as you are from Southeast Asian country, maybe the majority of them coming from Bangladesh. These are people who may never have left their village. They tend to speak an incredible number of languages, like Arabic and English are among them. You have very little chance of ever pulling yourself out of poverty to stay where you are. So you've heard about an opportunity to go to the rich Gulf and work for a few years, and then come back home, and you could buy property, you could invest, you don't have to go to the Grameen Bank, have your own money. So you would, and the way you've heard to get there is to go to a city, and you go to a labor supply agency who says, well, we'll get you there, but you're going to have to pay us, say, $3,000, $2,500, $3,000. That's more money than you've ever seen in your life, and you don't have it. So you sell your wife's gold jewelry, you mortgage your small house, and you collect all the money you can from your relatives, and you get $1,000. You need to go to a money lender. The money lender, because you have no real collateral, you can't go to a bank, even the Grameen Bank. And so you take out a loan from a money lender at 10% per month. interest. You don't sign a contract, or maybe you sign a contract, or maybe you just sign your name on a blank piece of paper in your home country. Then you wind up in Abu Dhabi, or the Dubai airport, and you get sent to Abu Dhabi. There you sign a different contract, written in Arabic and English, which you don't understand, which may be completely different from what you thought you were doing. It may not only be a different job. I met people who thought they were going to be working cooking food for people in a hotel, because the name of the construction site was the name of a hotel that they wanted to build in the hotel, for a third of the money that they were promised. The average was often 50% less than you were promised by this labor sending agency in your home country, was what you actually wound up getting paid. So now you're on the work site. You may not be happy. You're there for about 3 years. Maybe you're being underpaid. Maybe you're being paid late. Maybe working conditions are poor. Maybe your housing conditions are poor. But you really have no recourse, because you owe money to the guy who lent it to you, and you are going to have to work for whatever it is that you've been offered. You can't unionize to demand better treatment. You also can't switch employers, because your work visa is limited to that specific employer. So if you quit, you are illegally present in the country. And it would be difficult to quit anyway, because the employer has your passport. So if you quit, you would be deported. If you try and get a new job, you'd be deported. Some people do quit and work for other employers, but only the most unscrupulous employers would be willing to take the risk to employ you, and in exchange for taking that risk, they're going to expect you even worse and pay you even less. So that's the sort of broad sphere. I mean, that's the whole sort of human story that one needs to think of, and that one needs to capture when one thinks about workers.
Okay, so that's the sense. That is that's a sense of what workers are essentially faced with in these particular kinds of contexts. Phil was the Human Rights Watch senior researcher for the Middle East and North African division. And so his insights, especially since we were trying to figure out, like, all right, what's at stake in this issue, were really important. The other person that was there was Peggy Deamer, who I said was a professor at Yale. She's the person all the way on the right. And she kept saying that, and she really brought home the importance of recognizing it's very difficult to expect architects to care about labor conditions on job sites halfway around the world, when often the working conditions in many offices were just as exploited. Peggy was inspired by the conversation that she published a collection of essays on the issue of architecture and labor, and also spearheaded the formation of the Architecture Lobby, which is an organization of, quote, as they describe it, architectural workers advocating for the value of architecture in the general public and for architectural work within the discipline. So, because at this point we realized that a public conversation would not be possible, we managed to get a group together for closed-door discussion where we shared our insights, questions, and concerns. And this is the event that Scott attended at the Architectural League. And these were people from, very, very known corporate firms and so forth. And that actually became the second event, which included Ed Meyer, FX Fowl, Peggy Deeman, and Reinhold Martin came back. We had Walid Rod of Gulf Labor and Andrew Ross, but we had Brad Samuels of In Situ, Bill Sharples of Shop came, Raphael Sperry of IDSR. It's an advocacy organization on the West Coast that's trying to get the AIA to sign on to basically stop building prisons, or get architects to stop building maximum security prisons. Smitas Srinivas, who is a planner, and Nisha Varia, who came from Human Rights Watch. So again, we had a much bigger and a second round of this discussion. So we're excited about the outcomes of these public discussions, and so we felt we should circulate what we've learned. So the next phase was to organize workshops to learn more about the issues and about construction workers. So one early effort was to examine the AIA's Code of Ethics. So we were like, okay, so if we're going to address the profession, what is it the profession has to say about this issue? And one of the things that we noticed was the difference about how much attention was given to ecological sustainability versus human sustainability. And one of the models we looked at was, of course, 20, 30 years ago, nobody knew anything about green building. But now, clearly, it's something that's on the curriculum of schools, and certainly now we have the structure of LEED certification and so forth. So I would imagine the Code of Ethics 20, 30 years ago had very little about sustainability. So we started to think about what would happen if we expanded, right, our human rights, the human rights platform as well. So as we received human rights reports, we realized how much of what research discussed were geographical and spatial. We also began to we started to think these things through for publications. So Gulf Labor did a book where we started to think of the larger implications. Architect as Worker, this is Peggy Deemer's book on architecture and labor. Dissonant Archives, which were about narratives of the Middle East. This was an e-flux, and one of the important things was we actually started to draw out these relationships. So we started to look at the questions of availability and forms of transportation, standards and condition of housing. All of these things appear in Human Rights Watch reports. So for example, this is The Dark Side of Migration, which was published by Amnesty International. And so we started to try to visualize and map these things, do what architects do, not just read the text, the law, the codes, whatever, but actually start to think about this. We use representational tools, the techniques of architecture, orthographic drawing, urban mapping, data spatialization, photo documentation to launch a critical analysis, theorizing architecture's entanglement with these geopolitical and economic structures. By focusing on case studies, we documented how large-scale building sites functioned as dynamic territory. We began to map the scenarios that we found in some of the reports. So this is the one from Dark Side of Migration. So these are, this is the data that was actually given by and collected by Amnesty International of workers going to Qatar. Then we started to look at the site. Okay, so who were the architects, the contractors, so forth, where were they located? So again, trying to spatialize, map, locate. To zoom in, look at, okay, so this is the campus that they were building. And so these were some of the construction sites around that area. And then these were the conditions of the workers. So these were some of the photographs of what the conditions that Amnesty International had documented, but this was actually the map of where that camp was. So we were very interested in using that to then initiate a series of workshops. So we had the drawings, we had the reports, we had information drawn from the panels to stimulate discussion for 2 workshops to try to create a guidebook, to try to create something like, all right, if we're learning all of this stuff, how do we package it in such a way to disseminate to our students, to our colleagues, to other professionals, to people who are outside of architecture who might have questions about how this works. So we had 2 panels. One was on the worker, one was on the architect. In the worker, we talked about migration, mapping rights and routes. We talked about housing workers. What might new architectural standards be for housing the workers? Site conditions. So what is the environment at job sites, and how could, how have best practices been instituted? What sorts of laws, right, have been passed both locally but also thinking globally? The second one we did was the architect. We started to think about design and construction networks. Principle of zero tolerance for exploitation. Again, we looked at worker housing. How would architects define principles of fair housing? So these are the kinds of things that we did. We had sketches. We talked about what kinds of issues that were coming up. And so you could see at the workshop, people were drawing on paper, big panels, and then each group sort of did a presentation back to the larger group as we started to talk about. And people made suggestions like, what if we had a labor lead, and that there were standards around, if we have fair trade coffee, why couldn't the same start to apply to building materials and construction processes? So thinking about a kind of labor lead was one thing that's come up, and other people have really thought, that's a really, really excellent, excellent way to begin to proceed. So, so along with the various events, we held a workshop actually on this question of labor lead at Office Us, which is part of the American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And again, that brought people like Peggy Deemer. Ava Frank was the organizer of that. We worked with the basic fellows who were working, they were the partners in Office Us. And so we worked on this for a weekend. And that was great because we had the CEO of HOK actually came. So it was interesting to kind of put him on the hot seat around these issues. But Phil Bernstein, who's been, a person we've been in conversation all along. Phil teaches a fantastic class on professional practice at Yale. He's also a research and development VP, is that correct, Scott? At AutoCAD. And so Phil's very much interested in these issues, like what if there were a Revit plugin that actually had to deal with labor costs and issues? So he's been very much a person that we've been talking this issue with this issue about as well. So we ended up being invited to show this work at the Istanbul Biennale. And part of it was the future is not what it used to be. So thinking about other trajectories, not the futurism that will make a better world, but what is the reality of our world and how are we going to deal with it now? And so I think that's why we were asked to join. And essentially what we reproduced there was our workspace, which was always sitting around tables and conversing, drawing, and talking. And then the posters on the wall are really sort of action points, things that actually can be done, to begin to enact things in the offices and on the job site. And one of the things that we thought was really, really, really important was to show, and we realized that because of the atomization of actually architectural services, it's very difficult to think of the relationship of what you're drawing to the other person who's on the other end, who's actually constructing it. And this came up time and time again. So what if we had a large map, we call it the table drawing, that actually showed where architects, materials, engineers might be coming from, where, like a village, where someone who might be a farmer then becomes recruited, and then becomes the worker, and how they basically converge on a job site as well. And so this is the kind of narrative that we actually began to tell as workers leave the villages, what they actually have to do in terms of training, what happens at the local airport. From the other end, how architects work with structural engineers to develop the truss details, basically how the truss then gets manufactured and shipped. So thinking about how people and materials end up on the job site. So these are the ways in which, again, our architectural drawings and the ways in which we've been mapping and understanding this come as a way of making visible these sort of hidden networks. And then thinking about how these converge actually on the job site itself. So that's the long table. But then, expand site observations, improve basic standards, redefine the lexicon of what things are described as. Expand the code of ethics, reconfigure the organizational chart, realign new technologies, thinking, in what ways might technologies actually transform how knowledge is delivered on site, but the kinds of labor and the ways in which people become trained to actually produce work that might actually reduce wages, for example. And the last thing that we've been working on is a critical field guide, which is not out yet, but will soon be out. We're just finishing up work on that. And that collected all these findings together as a call to action to address the problems that we found in varying degrees on construction sites worldwide. There is not one solution to this problem. Improvement in international labor laws brokered between those nations who send workers and those nations who host them is one area. And many of the problems, such as worker access to transportation, decent housing, are ones where the expertise of the architect could lead to innovative design approaches. Architects do have leverage within the construction processes to transform how buildings are made and to improve the conditions for those who build their architecture. The actions we propose are provocations that creatively engage various facets of practice and education. So I'll just go through this quickly. And so that's sort of all the layout of the field guide pages. So we ask and explain, how do workers migrate to the construction site? So each section is a question, we respond, but then we offer visualizations, documentations. Well, this is the passport, or this is the document that's needed. So to help people really understand, okay, precisely what's going on in these contexts. And then, of course, like how to act to promote fair labor. So not just inform, but what kinds of actions might be possible. And again, using a lot of the sketches around, this idea of fair building, it's a fair built building, thinking about network systems, different kinds of layers, media, how that might be important. And to think about, there are the ethical dimensions, there are the economic dimensions, and then there are the legal dimensions of this issue, and they're all interrelated. And these, make new diagrams of linkages and power relations amongst all actors, so literally redefining the organizational chart. One project that we're currently developing is an actual case study in Istanbul that we call Who Builds Istanbul, which has its own set of problems, not necessarily transnational ones, although that's part of it. And so we're working with union groups. We're working with architects in the city, thinking about projects like this is the Apple Store in Istanbul, in terms of that being one of these transnational projects that literally plug in, but also looking at the city's building practices, because there have been many, many problems with deaths on job sites and lack sort of oversight in terms of both worker housing and worker safety. And this is a big issue that the architects themselves are concerned about. So we were asked to come back and to basically take our research and contextualize it. So we're developing a project called Who Builds Istanbul, which will be a series of workshops in May and September on that. But what's important for us is to think about the nature of a practice, is to look back at the tools that we use to practice and in what ways could they be used in a kind of critical way. And so, to think about these relationships. So one of the missions of WBYA is to clarify the complex and abstract processes of the architectural process, trying to reconnect the labor of the design process to the labor of building construction. Quite often, this has led to an uncomfortable and sometimes awkward relationship to the architectural profession and to the very real work of producing drawing, procuring materials, adhering to budgets and schedules. But being here within the context of an architecture school, I think reaffirms the position that what we are trying to do is fully within the long and varied tradition of architectural practices. You are the future of the profession, and these are the issues that you have the potential to reshape. Architecture as a discipline has always included a healthy questioning, not just of the ever-contentious meanings of form and beauty, but also the means and methods of design, craft, technique, and meaning. This is Georgia Tech, after all. In other words, practice. Like many projects that we've shown and thought about, WBYA attempts to do what, and I think these were the words of a curator, Giovanna Borassi, which we really thought was fantastic, was to challenge the precepts and ultimate goals of the profession. That's how Giovanna described a critical practice. So we believe that this question of construction worker labor is one that architects are obligated to acknowledge within their scope and responsibility and accept it as part of the process of building and designing buildings. We propose that labor issues should fall under the purview of professional ethics. The current code of ethics for the AIA contains a one-sentence general statement on human rights. Quote, members should uphold human rights in all professional endeavors, end quote. Elsewhere in the AIA's Code of Ethics, the architect's obligation to the environment includes 3 tenets that uphold sustainable design, development, and practices. At the root of environmental sustainability is the support of human life. Therefore, should not the human rights section be more emphatic, expansive, and descriptive in the architect's obligation to human sustainability? Architects, of course, can't, as I've said, solve the problem alone. The solution will require legal intervention, economic incentives, and grassroots activists from all participants in order to achieve a fair resolution to the workers. We believe that as a social justice issue, the problem should be treated and acted upon in the same manner as in the same vigor as environmental concerns have been addressed through the development of sustainability practices and protocols over the last 4 decades. Human sustainability should be an urgent matter for architecture to consider. Thank you.
I have a lot of questions, but maybe we'll just open it up, and if anybody has any thoughts or questions about this. I mean, I'm going to start with, I mean, it's very interesting to me to think about this dilemma that architects probably find themselves in wanting to make a difference. I can imagine that the resistance you got from the architects were probably not driven by the fact that they didn't want to say something, but that they would lose work, lose jobs. You know, that it was the pressure from clients, the pressure from contractors, and the kind of the increasing distance that architects are finding themselves in from the actual construction process. I mean, this has been an ongoing evolution that has affected, you know, the discipline and the profession of architecture for a long time. So, you know, so I think there is a real dilemma here, but I think the questions still do remain, like, you know, as architects, what can we do about this? You know, how can we actually have an impact? And I can imagine there are different ways. You know, when you're talking about Frank Gehry or Zaha Hadid, the threat of actually quitting a job would actually have an enormous impact, probably, right? I mean, they have a different kind of leverage than other architecture firms might have. So it seems like there's multiple ways in which architects can engage this issue. The labor lead idea, which I think we discussed in the panel, the idea there was that everybody knows what LEED is. You know, it's essentially, LEED didn't exist, I don't know, 10 years ago, 7 years ago, and it has now become something that literally is mandated on most projects. You have to get LEED certified. So that was invented, created, there were values proposed, and the industry bought into that. Architects bought into it, owners bought into it, contractors bought into it. The idea of a similar kind of measurement policy to measure the impact on labor was, I think, a really clever idea. I don't remember who came up with it, but it was a really clever idea. But that might be the most effective way to do it, because it mobilizes all of the players that are part of building a building, and it creates a kind of value to the idea that you would really put labor as an issue. So anyway, these are just all thoughts, but I think it ties together in the context of the school. It ties together design, it ties together practice, it ties together theory, it ties everything together. So I think it's really great that this is brought up. So anyway, those are my ramblings. Marcel, yeah.
I had a question that actually ties into this idea of providing a kind of lead designation of. I don't need it.
I know,
Do I really need it?
No, but
okay. But you know, it occurs to me that I don't know if you have tackled this yet, because it's another aspect to the problem, which is the materials that come to the job site, how they're extracted, under what conditions, et cetera, that we already have a system in place for the greening of materials that kind of tracks that. If there's a way that could also be integrated, the extraction and the conditions under which materials are actually manufactured and brought to the site is another huge problem. And I think that that's where we have more control as architects, because we do specify, we do control the specification of materials, whereas we don't really control the means and methods anymore contractually. So again, that's another issue, but have you all looked into that a little bit more in depth?
Yeah, I mean, we have. And that was, well, we haven't looked at it in depth, but that was one of the things that we understood, was the fact that you could start to put pressure precisely on the kinds of materials that you specify. And, you know, sort of ask that fair labor practices go into the making of these particular materials that we're actually utilizing on our building, and that could also be a part of, oh, there's a checklist for that, and that absolutely does that. One of the things that has come up, and I think it was Phil Bernstein who suggested it, he said, he's a man of the market, shall we say, correct, Scott? Yeah. So Phil's argument was, look, ethics are great, and we'll let the lawyers do the legal, but fundamentally, if you want a solution, you're going to have to incentivize it financially. And so if you made it so that both the architect, you know, there wasn't necessarily a firewall, but there was an overlap between the architect and the contractor, and there was the sense that if there were no deaths, no harm, workers were treated fairly on the job site, it would incentivize it financially, actually, from your pockets to make sure that all of it was in well-working order. And it would also, again, make the client also look good. That you could say, oh, my building was. So he is essentially, you know, sort of arguing to incentivize it as well. But one of the things I wanted to add to Scott in terms of partially why we thought, one of them is, yeah, the scaring away of clients, but other, you know, it's business. Running a practice is a lot of hard work, and most people are really trying to make payroll. And it's exhausting. And it's like, you want me to take on one more issue, and I'm just trying to make sure the people that work for me are taken care of. And I think that is also sort of part of the challenge, in a way, of just the nature of how architecture practice actually functions as well. But it is potentially, you know, the cumulative small efforts that multiple could make that actually might make a difference in how the people on the other end in the kinds of work that they're doing and their lives might be improved as well. Paolo Tombesi, who did a really great essay in your book, Scott, I think talks about this in particular in relation to the global construction industry and the kinds of pressures that can be put in, you know, different stages of the processes of moving material, of producing material for construction, and just construction techniques in general, methods of construction.
George.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. I have a lot of questions, but I guess maybe this is would sort of say that maybe one way this is being analyzed is while very much cognizant of a kind of a network of actors and the flow of power and capital through that network, it's still very much a top-down kind of analysis in a way that just accepts the fait accompli of that, or at least recognizes a certain fait accompli of this sort of extenuation of the forces of capitalist modernity in what, you know, used to be called the developing world. And it's really a manifestation of North American and European kinds of patterns, which really go way, way back, and we could look at similar kinds of manifestations here, there, and so on. I guess I'm just thinking of, you know, what sort of alternative there might be, and I guess I would just sort of say maybe one that's very compelling these days is when you see the mass design group talking about going to places, teaching building practices to indigenous populations, or actually helping them catalyze their own building traditions to build up a social kind of organizational strategy from the bottom up, that is also, you know, in terms of your question, what can architects do? That's a compelling example of where their forces can arise from the bottom up as well as from the top down. And that doesn't necessarily accept as an absolute that fait accompli. I'm just curious, I mean, surely that sort of approach must be within the sort of realm of approaches this work would address.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great comment. Thinking about sort of other forms of practice in construction, and I guess something that we've thought about. My colleague Katamari has this really great example of a film. No, it's not a film, but it's a project from an architect that was basically using, I could say, indigenous labor in a part of India, right, to make local bricks. And part of what she said was that what was not happening, there was a kind of romanticization of local craft and not realizing there were other much more complex economic forces about who was actually moving into the region, who was taking those jobs, whatever. But the way the architect was presenting, this is a well-known Indian architect, actually, whose work is quite beautiful, was presenting it, oh, look at, we're doing this with, but also, you know, that wasn't sort of identifying if there were these sort of underlying global forces also producing certain conditions within that. And so I think it's kind of complicated, the local global. Mm-hmm. I will say in Google, Istanbul, one of our collaborators, Nishar Advan, I think his last name is Advan, is doing a project. He's an urbanist architect. He's doing a project, a housing project actually, outside of Istanbul that is going to be using a completely different organizational structure of construction that the people who are going to be moving in will be part of the construction crew, the architects are part of the construction crew, that he's really, his concern, you know, he was one of the journalists, actually, who was pointing to the problems of construction deaths, construction site deaths, what he called labor murders in Turkish. And so his response was, is there another way to build? And he's using this project, he's been able to get money from the state, which had to do with the fact that the village had been wiped out by an earthquake several years back. And so that's one thing that we're going to actually discuss as a kind of case study, is are there other kinds of configurations around how does one build that might be much more locally based, actually.
If I just say one thing, and I'll hand this over to Michael. That was very, in the essay in the more recent one, that's probably the parallel to this piece, in the Deamer book, The Architect as Worker, I think it's called. You take that idea of Tom Bazy's, and in a way, the sort of point is the realization of who's at the other end of your BIM model, right? And so suddenly the idea that when one's interacting in the making of using these tools that allow this sort of displaced collaboration, really the workers are ultimately a part of that network of relationships crystallized in the BIM model. What I'm understanding is you're saying you're trying to create a map in this project where people begin to understand the relationships that are part of that network.
Yeah.
I think that's a super project.
Yeah, no, I like the idea of who's on the other end of it.
It's fascinating presentation. Couple of questions. How do you distinguish between what would be considered black market practices and what would be considered open, sort of, quote, legitimate labor practices on the one hand? And then secondly, have you looked at examples in the United States or other sort of premier first world construction markets where you would apply the same sort of logic to worker housing conditions? Because I'm trying to distinguish in the research between the quality of labor environment on the job and then the quality of environment off the job. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up, because I didn't mention that in the talk, but that is something that this happens in our own backyard. This is clearly not over there, but actually happening in, this goes on in New York City all the time, where often you find undocumented workers who might be doing various kinds of trades on site are often exploited. I mean, they're the ones that don't get paid, or the subcontractor runs off with the money, and because they're undocumented, they're not necessarily going to go protest, so it makes them vulnerable. They might be living out in Queens, and they literally might be hotbedding an apartment, so it might be in the back, in a basement, not a lot of light, and they're basically renting a bed. They sleep there during the day, somebody else comes there, and so these kinds of conditions are global. They're not just over there, but have to do with unequal power relations that you're finding all over the place. I think a lot of times the biggest problems aren't necessarily the high-profile architects. I think the Starchitects are visible precisely because, and Gulf Labor went after Frank Gehry and the Guggenheim because it was visible, and to make that a model for how one would do work. Most likely, the Guggenheim would have probably made sure that this didn't happen, but NYU was, for example, had an agreement that it was not going to be using or hiring people directly that would have exorbitant fees, recruiting fees, right? And they didn't, but their subcontractors did, right? And so nonetheless, the building was being built with all of these bad labor practices, essentially. And so sometimes it's very difficult to pull that. And a lot of times the worst ones aren't the big names, are the smaller, local, are doing the infrastructural projects where, they kind of slide under the radar. So it's very, very complex in terms of, like where you identify, but we're simply, our goal is to just make visible the problem and try to find out people who are going to be willing to take up the various solutions. I mean, I don't know international labor law. I don't even know human rights law per se, but I've learned a little and realized there are people who have the expertise who really take on. And the other thing is that we are targeting the architects for that's our community. You know, but there are groups who work very directly with the workers and who take on their issues as well. Our project in Istanbul is actually going to try to bring those two groups together and see, but we also feel, you know, that we can't necessarily, although, you know, some of our collaborators have been to Doha and have been to Kathmandu and really understand those relationships, but we're not necessarily going to be able to go to a particular place, work locally with recruitees, you know, to those being recruited to solve this. I mean, we have a limited scope, so we're going to try to really aim strategically at where we can put the pressure point and see what happens.
Thank you for doing this work, and thank you for coming to present your work to us so eloquently today. Two short related questions. The first question is it useful to distinguish between the general conditions in the labor market and conditions specifically to do with work safety while you build? Would the issue of safety be more directly linked to what architects design and prescribe? And second, and related to that, are safety at work issues in any way affected by whether one designs with conventional versus new fabrication technologies?
That's actually a really good question. That's what part of what I think we're going to figure out in Istanbul, because it is sort of an isolated case, and from what we've gathered, it's very interesting. We talked with, we spent an afternoon with Ara in Istanbul, and the director of the European division happens to be based in Istanbul, and has spent a lot of time there, and actually talked about the differences between how the construction industry actually works, the building industry works in Turkey as opposed to elsewhere in Europe. And he said there's a different kinds of set of practices, there are different power relations that have to do with how money comes into a job site, who is actually responsible for building, and the relationship of the architect to both the client and the contractor. And in Turkey, essentially, the client and the contractor are often the same person, which is very interesting. And so he was just telling us, because of that, the architect has a very different relationship in terms of the ability to supervise certain things on job sites, which are quite different, which also has something to do with the fact that, for example, we were touring a very, very major construction site, and the architect who was giving us a tour had no idea that there had been 2 deaths on the job site over the course of construction. Like, no, that had not been reported at all to the architect. So there was a different sense of the control and circulation of information in those. And so I think they're it depends on context, and I think that working on the Istanbul project will help us start to see precisely what you're talking about the differences between how health and safety gets dealt with as opposed to where labor is coming from and the issues that, because, for example, there is migration, there's Syrian workers, for example, there are Kurdish workers, but you don't have, like, Qatar is very odd, because it's like 90% of the labor force in Qatar is expatriates, right? And so, you know, each of these have very different, you know, kinds of profiles in terms of these issues. But I think you're right, absolutely, the question of what is going on around safety on the job site versus what's happening within the labor market are distinct. But what we realized were, okay, if there are issues of housing for the workers, you know you're going to need X number of thousands of workers here. So why couldn't the architect be a part, work with the client to sort of figure out a phasing, right? That you would actually build the worker camp as part of it, as opposed to subcontracting out. But you actually see this as part of a kind of system that is organic to the construction process. I mean, imagine a good model of that, you know, that actually sort of shows how it can grow and contract and transform. And these are things that I think architects' expertise and architects think could help perhaps drive unique solutions. So I think these are really, really great questions around the nuances.
After all that.
Not having incorporated these practices of housing for workers for what the case is.
So are you asking
If we shift to what you just proposed,
Yeah.
the new paradigm, does the architect take responsibility for?
No, it's not a question the architect taking responsibility for it, but suppose if the client realizes I have to build this very large project and I have this land that's adjacent. And as part of that, that might even be a cost saving. We don't know. I mean, just sort of look at, as opposed to paying a third party, maybe there's a way start to generate, right, a place of where workers can actually live that actually has the amenities so that people live well while they're actually constructing. Wouldn't that make their work better and more focused? For example, the job site which we'll probably take a look at, the job site I just saw in Istanbul, there were about 600 workers actually living on site in one of the buildings that had not been, sort of fitted out yet, which we thought was, we didn't see this, but we're hoping to actually go back and see that. And so to start to think about the logistics of construction and whether or not, as opposed to getting, containers literally from manufactured from Singapore and shipping them, is there a way to start to think about, almost like like with refugee and crisis planning, like, okay, so what if we started to think about housing workers? And right now, for example, the Qatar Foundation has come up with a set of what I think are really great best practices to solve their really difficult problem. But I think the kind of aesthetic quality and the level of thought that I think architects potentially could bring to the problem in a more nuanced way could be more interesting. Very generic. We know architects are involved in their best practices, but could be a part of it. But I don't think that architects have to be responsible, but I just think the expertise of the architect when aimed at the problem could come up with some innovative solutions. So, and what's interesting, for example, when you read the Human Rights Watch reports, when they come back for solutions, a lot of them are legal and very, very important. And a lot of the conditions they're describing, though, sometimes are spatial, architectural, and urban. And so why, besides lawyers, why couldn't architects be a part of the thinking of how do we drive solutions to these problems as well? But we're somehow not a part of it. And the lawyers aren't necessarily, they can see, that the water doesn't work and there's poor sanitation and there's garbage. But they're lawyers and they're not thinking more systematically about how to drive solutions. But imagine if architects were a part of the Amnesty International team, sort of brainstorming with whatever state representatives about how to solve that. And that's why I mean the expertise of the architect, because if this is what we do, could actually be very valuable in driving.
So I have a question about this immigrant, labor transfer, because to me this has been a tradition in the Middle East. I mean, it's just been happening for years and years. And I mean, I remember when I was a little girl in Iran, there were people from Afghanistan that would come there, and I would just see them put tents up to help build a building. So this is, to me, this is like an old tradition that's embedded into the nations there. So I know that there are attorneys that, they focus on human rights, let's say, and so they partner with other organizations to educate the immigrants that are coming in to better understand what they're doing. So you're kind of resolving the issue of that whole tradition, So is there any partnerships or anything that you guys have considered making so that you can go into the core of the problem and break into that tradition? Because I'm not sure if the governments are willing to give that effort to educate them. So is there any partnerships that you guys in particular are making to change the society and the tradition of what's going on for years and years there?
Of worker population. So there's you're absolutely right, there is a tradition of this in the Middle East of how that works. But I think what's being exploited is the idea that with the kafala system you were supposed to have, you have somebody who basically sponsors you, right? So you come and you get sponsored. And it was just simply everybody wanted a piece along the way. And so what was happening, workers weren't being paid, their passports were being taken away, they weren't getting the proper worker permit. They were being told, as Bill said, they were being told they were doing one thing and doing another. And so the system was actually not in the best interest of the workers. And that's part of the problem of what was supposed to be done. Like, for example, people were being paid in cash as opposed to electronic transfer, which meant that people would get paid, if they got paid at all, were paid in cash. Then they would have to go to a Western Union and have the money then wired back as a remittance to the family. I think Qatar has now instituted that it's mandatory that it actually be an electronic fund transfer. So if they wanted the funds transferred back to wherever it is that they came from, it goes directly, as opposed to being paid in cash, then having to potentially get to some place that may not even be convenient if you're living way on the other side of town. So trying to make it so that these gaps where exploitation can occur no longer exist. And so that's part of it. You know, again, this is not my big project. I have all these other projects. This is one of the things that I work on. And so we felt it was just important to try to publicize these issues, and then to see those people who really have the expertise and, you know, who can really pick this up. It's going to be, you know, it's like it's going to take years for this to resolve itself. But I think it's a worldwide problem, and it's going to have to be taken up in some way or another at some point. So.
I noticed. Is this on? Yeah. I noticed you didn't make any distinction between skilled and unskilled labor. My question is there really a difference in the treatment, and is there a way for these considerations to be applied earlier in the design process?
That's actually really, yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. My understanding is that a lot of this has to do with unskilled workers, people who don't necessarily know precisely what they're doing. And so you just throw a bunch of bodies at it, basically. A colleague of mine, well-known practice, is doing work in Texas, and they were essentially saying, I mean, they were essentially appalled at the kind of labor practices of this project. It's, you know, been published all over the place. It's a really great building. But at one point, the contractor said, yeah, I'll just throw as many people as I can at it, you know, and at the you know, whatever the task was, because the labor was cheap, right? And it was unskilled, and, you know, some were knowledgeable, some weren't, but that was the kind of strategy, was literally to throw a number of bodies at it. And so there is a problem of the question of being skilled and unskilled. This is one of the issues that, it's difficult. This is one of the issues that SHOP brought up in terms of, this was Bill Sharples, who was part of one of our discussions, in terms of what they were saying about fabrication methods, which has its own questions around labor practices as well. But one of the things that they were trying to do in a project they were doing in Kenya was to basically skill up the labor force in terms of the fabrication process. So part of the reason that they were going to try to build in a particular way was that they would embed, you know, the ability and the knowledge of that construction of the machines and, you know, the assembly locally. So you wouldn't fly in a group of people to assemble, or even, you know, fabricate it elsewhere and ship it, but that you would actually do it basically locally, and that would be building up a skilled labor force. But they said, you know, like the other example was a project in Botswana, for example. These are both projects in Africa that SHOP was doing. The Botswana problem was particularly acute because there actually had been a skilled labor force there. And what had happened was it basically, you know, it somewhat disappeared because Chinese companies were coming in and doing construction. They were bringing their own workers. And so those people who had particular knowledge that should have been working on those projects weren't, and they just drifted into, you know, other sectors of work, essentially. So, you know, again, there are these different local conditions as well. But a lot of this has to do with, you know, the problem of unskilled work being cheap and accessible.
Tristan, did you want one more question?
I was curious, are you engaging the contractors in this conversation? And if so, what is their reaction?
That is something that we would like to do in Istanbul, actually, is to try to get, you know, one of the builders to actually come and talk to us and be a part of the workshop to discuss some of the issues. And so we're hoping through our contacts with architects that we can actually bring a builder, so you have worker-builder architects sort of discussing the series of problems in that. But no, as we've been going along, it's not, because we've been trying to think about what kind of what architects are actually doing, and like how the architects deal with their array of basically professional roles, like what that could be.
But it's almost like you want to attack it from both perspectives with your architectural skill, right? Excuse me, because you could be embedded within those organizations, applying your architectural thinking from within, while also sort of exerting pressure.
Yeah, and that's what was interesting. Like when they were in Istanbul, and I showed the picture of the work, we met with a group of very young architects who are working. And one of the ways in which people work, you go work for an architect, but you can also be an architect working for a builder, basically, which is also oftentimes literally the client who's doing work. A number of them were basically in that situation. They were essentially working for builders doing shop drawings and other things. And so because of their interest in the question of labor, that's actually where they ended up in terms of working. And that's also, you know, again, that's why we feel like in Istanbul we have an opportunity to bring that because of the particular way in which the construction industry is arranged there. But it's interesting that they see their role in that. That's where they've positioned themselves. They've worked for, you know, and there was a woman that had worked for very well-regarded, you know, item design. Architect does beautiful work there, and just was not happy, and then ended up working for construction companies. But also that's, you know, there was another young architect, and you know, she basically said that what was being asked of her, particularly on job sites, was that she was going to be the fall person if something went wrong. But she was young, and she was asked to take on and basically sign off on things that she knew, you know, weren't correct and weren't above board. And she knew that if something went wrong, she was going to get scapegoated for it. And she quit. I mean, she quit, and she's actually suing basically suing the construction company for that reason. So it's interesting, particularly on that side as well.
All right, Jude, last question.
I appreciate the talk very much, but it must be tough to deal with this issue for a sustained time. It's a very heavy-hearted kind of concern. It's interesting to talk when it's possible we might have a contractor as president here. And if you think about the last administration, vice president was a contractor. And if you look close to it, and so I wonder, this is a great critique, and I understand that a large portion of the problem is in Asia and in non-democratic contexts, but you would think that you could apply a critique in a democracy, somehow be the foundation for a positive product. But then when I look around, I wonder just what exactly would be the best thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's this kind of confusion about immigrants. Well, our construction industry couldn't exist without them. So before you look very far, we have a peasant class that's building our own. But to whom would you appeal to change this? That would be an interesting question for me. How would you build this as a kind of critique with the light shine on it that could affect the most people? Because in the end, I don't want to put an architect on the hot seat per se. I think we're the least equipped in a way in terms of our power. I mean, I know we're culpable, we're part of the situation, but I really think we're citizens too, and we have to appeal to a larger constituency. But it feels like in America, and it's sad to say this, but there's such a deep corruption. We've gotten used to looking at things and not acknowledging what's in front of us. This is a rhetorical question. I think there's an answer to it, but if anyone has any comments.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely right. I always ask my students, we're sitting in a room, and I always say, do you know anybody, you know, here we are in this room with all this stuff, do you know any person who's made anything in this room? And they're like, they start looking around, like the table, the chairs, you know, the paint on the wall, the carpet, you know. No. I said, okay, think about something on your body. And I always get, my friend made my earrings, or something like that. That's about as close as you get. And then it helps them start to think about, like, you know, how complicated it is in the ways in which the production of the things that make our lives possible. They're coming from all over the place with people, who knows where they are. So it's a very, very, very challenging question to even ask, who makes whatever. So, yeah, it is.
Herman.
One response, and I'd love to get your take on what Jude was saying, is that when we were pursuing doing work in Kenya, the Exim Bank had set up something to really try and promote more U.S. involvement. And part of that was that there would be more control over who the workers actually were. Because also during that time, it was thought, believed, assumed that the bulk of the workers doing work in Nigeria, especially in Lagos, they were coming from Chinese prisons with one-way tickets. And not only was that a problem because there was a lack of technology transfer, but it was now basically appearing that one country was sort of emptying out those that they didn't want in their country, somewhere else, benefiting from the labor, and that labor being something of shoddy work. So the idea that was being tackled there was one from a financial perspective. But certain dollars would now be awarded if those types of things were observed and addressed, so that basically what happened in the city, you would try and create something of technology transfer to the people that lived in the country, as opposed to exporting. I don't know if that's something from the financial side that you've been able to address.
Yeah.
Some of your operations.
Yeah, I mean, that might be why Shop was trying to, in their project in Kenya, do what they did. I mean, that might have been actually the impetus behind why they were thinking about constructing this project in the way that they did. But yeah, I mean, the question of Chinese labor in architecture is in a completely different project. Like really a set of things that I work on with Global Africa Lab, that was something that's actually come up around that. And the way in which, and again, I think this is Paolo Tombezi's work, sort of addresses this, the importance of having kind of sort of the question of local labor and how you keep people trained and knowledgeable so they essentially are skilled workers as opposed to the descaling of populations. But no, we haven't looked at it directly, but I think that's a really great example, and maybe it's answering some of the reason of why Shop was proposing to do what it's doing. And I do know that with some of the architects we spoke with early on, just, you know, people will say, well, what am I to do? Like, what's my role? And one architect we spoke at, or very early on, I mean, she was doing work in Cairo, she's doing work, I think, in Mumbai, and she said, after I talked with you, and she's like, now I'm much more, and she said, I ask, where are your workers housed? Like, all of a sudden, she became much more aware of these issues and started to ask about them, which even that kind of gesture may make a difference in some way or another. So part of what this project, again, to do is to simply make people aware and try to initiate a conversation and sort of help people understand the complexity of what's often invisible.
Okay, this could go on, but I think we should probably stop. Mabel, but this has really been I can tell you, comparatively, this has been a great extended discussion. So I think you've really hit on something that will continue to be discussed. So thank you very much. Yeah.